Good evening and welcome to Heterodox Academy. For those of you tuning in for the first time, I'm Kyle Vitale, Director of Programs here at HXA, and I'll be briefly introducing the evening and our speaker. Just a quick note that because we're in a Zoom room and not a webinar, we very much appreciate you keeping your mics muted. We like to keep the spotlights a bit more organic, so there will be an open question period a little bit later. But we appreciate your attention to mic etiquette in the meantime, as the first half of this event is recorded. And a hello to our viewers watching this later through our YouTube channel. If you are new to HXA's work, Heterodox Academy is a nonpartisan nonprofit committed to improving research and education by increasing open inquiry, viewpoint diversity, and constructive disagreement in higher education. We have more than 5,000 members from institutions across the country and around the globe. If you're interested in our community, resources, exclusive events, and programs, it is free to join. You can visit heterodoxacademy.org/join to learn more. Just a quick note that if you enjoyed this evening's event, we are running our Member Spotlight series all fall. Please check out our events page on the website for upcoming events, including next week's talk about making civil discourse happen on campus. Several more events are being announced in the coming weeks as well. So without further ado, let's turn to this evening. Our theme this fall is higher education in an ailing republic. How can teaching, writing, and research contribute to improving our democracy and improve itself for the sake of our democracy? Our speaker and his research tonight has some answers for us. Tonight's event will be in two parts. The first will be our speaker's address. This will be recorded for our YouTube channel. So again, we strongly encourage all mics to stay off. But part two will be a live, unrecorded Q&A with our speaker. We'll invite questions via Zoom's raise hand function or by typing into the chat. As always, this is HXA, so we encourage challenging, authentic questions asked in good faith and constructively. Now, I am pleased, finally, to introduce our speaker. Matthew Hitt is Monfort Professor and Associate Professor of Political Science at Colorado State University. He studies American political institutions, especially the judiciary, Congress, and the media. His books, Inconsistency and Indecision in the United States Supreme Court, Homestyle Opinion, How Local News Can Slow Polarization, which came out in 2021, and Time Series Analysis for the Social Sciences, are available from University of Michigan Press and Cambridge University Press. Hitt's research has regularly appeared in top political science and law journals and has received attention from major public journals, including The Atlantic and New York Times. Matthew, welcome, and please take us away.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kyle, and thank you everybody for making the time on a Thursday evening to come hear about some of the work that I've been doing with some co-authors. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here because I do have some slides to talk through the material tonight. Let me just do that here. Okay. All right. Let's see. All right, everyone should be able to see that now, I believe. So let us begin. All right, so tonight I'm going to be talking about a research agenda I've been working on since about 2016, 2017. And the title of the talk is The Fourth Branch, How Local Newspapers Can Rewrite Our Fragmented World. Now, the fourth branch is an intentional title that I really like for this research agenda. My background is as a scholar of American political institutions. And I tend to view the study of the media in American politics from an institutionalist perspective. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight is the institutional presence of local news and its effects on American politics. So to begin, I'm going to establish some pretty common ground that should be of a surprise to approximately no one here tonight. American politics are experiencing deep and significant degrees of polarization at both the mass and elite level. And as a political scientist, I want to take just a moment to put some empirical meat on that bone. So what you see here is the distance between the party means in the House and the Senate going back to Reconstruction, 1880. You see the red line there is the House. So this is the absolute ideological distance between the mean voter of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party in both chambers of Congress. And there on the x-axis there, you've got the years. So going up into our time period here, you can see this difference between the parties in terms of voting behavior, ideology in Congress is as bad as it's been since Reconstruction. So America's political elites, our parties in government are far apart from each other in ideological terms. This should surprise no one, right? The American mass public, and this point is a bit more controversial in the scholarship, but it's becoming increasingly clear that in several important ways, ordinary Americans are also increasingly ideologically sorted and polarized. So here we see some measures of sorting. So the median Democrat and the median Republican in the mass public are able to sort themselves correctly, so to speak, that's such that someone who identifies as a Democrat is likely to be consistently liberal in their policy positions, and those who identify as Republican are likely to be consistently conservative in their survey answers to policy questions. So we're seeing a matching between the party label you pick and the ideology that you support, that the policy positions that you take. So we're seeing this, what we would call sort of spatial or ideological polarization. That's what this chart is showing here. So America's elites are polarized in Congress. The American public is polarized in spatial and policy terms. But perhaps more troubling and perhaps of interest to the educators here in the room and with the theme of the fall's series here for HXA, we're not just worried about this sort of ideological disagreement, right? That, well, Republicans tend to be conservative. They like a certain set of policies. Democrats tend to be liberal. They like a different certain set of policies. No, we in political science, and I think this goes across a number of fields, we're worried about the social and the psychological elements of polarization, which is quite distinct from simply being in policy disagreement. So there's some great work here that goes back a number of years. Important people to call out here would include Liliana Mason and others. But we're increasingly seeing in political science this correlation between political identity, so are you a Democrat or a Republican, and other forms of social identity. Sometimes with my students, I like to give the example, if I told you, I know a person who drives a pickup truck, loves college football, attends an evangelical church, and likes hunting, you'd have a pretty good guess what political party they were. I have a similar caricature if you want for liberals, right? That didn't used to be the case, that all of these social and cultural things are increasingly correlated with political party. So now what this has done is constructed a society where the opposite party is a cultural and social outgroup, which means that losing an election, losing political power is not just a question of, well, will the marginal tax rates go up or down? Will the social welfare system get bigger or smaller? But really, my side of society, my side of the culture is, relatively speaking, winning or losing, which is much more threatening, which some folks would say is bad, to use a scholarly term. Regardless of whether you think it's a problem or not, political scientists have been measuring what we would call affective or an emotional dimension of polarization for a long time. So here we have some data from the American National Election Studies, a really nice longitudinal, nationally representative survey that's been going on for a very long time. What we've got here on your x-axis is election cycle. So this goes up to 2016, which you'll see why. And then on that y-axis, you've got a feeling thermometer rating. So this is a standard device. Many of you are probably quite familiar with it. We would ask a survey respondent on a level from 0, with 0 being very cold, absolute distaste, dislike, to 100 being very warm, very positive, like, yes, awesome. Where would you place your own political party? And where would you place the other major political parties? So if you're a Republican, from 0 to 100, how do you feel about the Republican Party? And then how do you feel about the Democrats? So that green line with the dots is in-party feeling. How do you feel about your own political party? And you actually see high rankings here, right above that pure neutral of 50. But you'll see that partisans don't necessarily love their party any more today than they did 40, 50 years ago. Not at all. That in-party feeling has remained pretty flat. What has changed, that we can document pretty well observationally here, the feelings toward the out party, and this holds for both Republicans and Democrats. Republicans and Democrats both report more negative affect towards the other party. So this is that purple line here. You can see a clear downward trend going up into the era we're in today. And then that final line, that's the difference between the two, how you feel about your party versus the other party. And that is what political scientists typically use as our measure of affective polarization. So there are many, many consequences and ramifications that come from this rising level of social, emotional, psychological polarization in the American electorate. We could spend a whole talk just talking about polarization. In fact, you could have a whole series about polarization. But one important consequence or related effect, at least, of what we're seeing in American politics today is a decline of split ticket voting, right? So in basic terms, would you cast your ballot for a candidate of one political party for a certain office and the opposite party for another? The most salient and significant way you could look at this is, would someone vote for a Republican for president and a Democrat for Senate from their state, and vice versa, right? You could think of a Trump voter in West Virginia who nevertheless supports Joe Manchin, something like that. And what we see here, that when you look at the percentage of voters who are splitting their tickets between the president and the Senate, between 1990 and 2014, you can see a clear and significant decrease in folks who are splitting their tickets here at the very top. So again, in the electorate, there's emotional polarization, there's ideological polarization, and then that is associated with and is downstream of potentially polarization in Congress itself. Where am I going? What would I like to talk to you about tonight? So setting this stage, this world of affective, social, emotional, and policy polarization, I'm going to make the argument that the decline and changes in the market for and the presence of local news has a polarizing effect on American political attitudes and behavior. And because I don't want to be just all doom and gloom, what can the institution of the political media potentially do about it? So there are two related, very closely related projects that I'd like to talk to you about tonight, to walk through a little bit. The first is a study that was published in 2018 in the Journal of Communication. I like to think this is one of the pithier titles in my career. Newspaper closures polarize voting behavior. Like, that's, you try and give away the punchline early in academia, right? And then the related book, which Kyle nicely mentioned, Homestyle Opinion, How Local Newspapers Can Slow Polarization, from Cambridge University Press. Both of these projects are complete with my fabulous co-authors, Dr. Joanna Dunaway at the Texas A&M University and Joshua Dar at Louisiana State University. Actually, the three of us were in Baton Rouge together when this whole research agenda kicked off. So I'd like to also thank the influence of beignets and gumbo on all the research you're about to hear, for better or for worse. So the market for and the presence of political news in the United States has undeniably changed in significant and meaningful ways. And this is just a handful of many of the terrific scholars over the years who have documented some of these changes. For example, Arsenault and Johnson are pointing out the fragmentation of national news in a partisan manner. Daniel Hopkins points out how our political media landscape has increasingly nationalized and the associated ramifications for political behavior thereof. So the political media scene has changed. And it's changing in two important ways. One obvious fact, if you think I myself grew up in Denver, Colorado, over the last few decades, Denver has not been immune from the nationwide trend of the closing of local newspapers. Anyone who remembers the Rocky Mountain News, may she rest in peace, has been lost. But here we see a map of the United States, and this map actually needs to be constantly updated. You could probably find a county here and there that isn't quite right, because newspapers are dying. They're shrinking. And you can see here, all your counties in red have not a single, not just daily, but even weekly local newspaper. Those counties in orange have but one. So we are seeing a significant decline in locally oriented newspapers. That's the subtraction side of things. Let's talk about replacement. What are people replacing that local news source with? Well, they're replacing with national media. And as we can see here, those replacements do not have necessarily the same ideological tenor and character and focus as your local news source might. So here's just one example. Here's some work, not ours, that estimates the typical ideology of speakers on your three major national cable networks. Again, surprising to no one, we see significant divergence between Fox News going in a more conservative direction and MSNBC correspondingly in a more liberal direction, with a less dramatic effect for CNN. So the market for political news at the national level serves a fragmented and well-sorted partisan constituency, which is not necessarily the case for, say, the Fort Collins Coloradoan here in Fort Collins, Colorado. We're lucky to still have our daily paper for now, so may they thrive. Let's also think about the consumers, the demand side of national political news. So here's some really nice data from Pew looking at the self-reported ideological placement of the typical American. There's your average respondent there, nationally representative, where they are on the ideological spectrum. And then where do you get your news? So as you can see here very easily, folks who watch Fox News self-report being more consistently conservative. If you read the New Yorker, again, not a huge surprise, you would self-report being more consistently liberal. And so there's a sorting on that national level. When the local news source dies, the replacements that are available in terms of where you can find political information provides more partisan content to a more partisan audience. So you have subtracted local news and replaced it with a fragmented and more partisan media environment. And we're seeing this more and more and more. This is, you can see just one example of a long-standing local newspaper in Youngstown, Ohio, saying, goodbye, we're done, see you later, since 1850. And we're seeing that, unfortunately, we are seeing that even in places that are keeping their local newspapers, and this isn't a focus of our work, there's a hollowing out of the news gathering function at the local level, and AP wire stories, nationally syndicated stories are taking up more and more of the oxygen. So that locally created news content, as it might relate to politics, civics, local affairs, is just really in decline. That leads us to sort of the culmination where we, as scholars of both political science, political institutions, and communication studies, come together. The 2016 election cycle was the first time in an extraordinarily long time in American politics where not a single state in the Union cast its electoral college votes for the candidate of one party, but elected a senator of the other party. Not one single state split their ticket at the statewide level. Susan Collins ruined that trend for us in 2020 by managing to get reelected from Maine while they went blue for Joe Biden. So, but in the past two presidential elections, think of all the senatorial elections that have occurred in those two cycles. One state manages to cast electoral votes for one party, elect a senator of the other. So we're seeing that split ticketing I was talking about in a very real and consequential way. Now, whether you think it's good or bad, I actually don't take a normative position on it, right? But regardless, it's a change. It's something that's different in political outcomes in this country. So to study one, to sort of where we enter this conversation, as local news content disappears, evaporates, dries up, and dies, that doesn't mean the demand side of political news has gone away. People who are interested in politics and current affairs, which is certainly not everybody, but those who are, will search for replacements. And those replacements are polarizing in terms of the content they put out and the audience they're serving. Their economic incentives are to continue serving the political preferences of the audience and all, and just in terms of the stories that are run, et cetera, et cetera. So these replacements, these nationally fragmented and partisan outlets, de-emphasize what we would term a cross-cutting identity, right? So I mentioned when we discuss affective polarization, when your social and cultural identity is wrapped up in your partisan identity, you feel the losses and the wins at the electoral level much more keenly. But cross-cutting identities, right? Someone who lives in your city, a Chicagoan, a New Yorker, right? Colosonian. We don't have a good word for ourselves. Fort Colonisian, right? Whatever we are, that's not necessarily something that's hooked into a partisan identity. Your geographic location is not necessarily tied up in this otherwise highly correlated world of social and cultural and political identity. So when you lose that reinforcement of a cross-cutting, non-politically associated identity, we argue that has the potential to nationalize political decision-making. Go by the partisan heuristic. Why worry about, what the ramifications for your little local community are? Rather, process political decision-making through the lens that the national political media presents it, which is primarily partisan wins and losses. So study one was a study of newspaper closures. And so we have data on daily and weekly newspapers that closed in the United States from 2009 to 2012. This comes from the Library of Congress as well as Chronicling America. Our dependent variable here was split ticket voting at the county level. So this is the percentage of voters in a county, this is in the 2012 election cycle, who split their ticket between president and Senate, right? So say 50% of a county, 51% of a county votes for President Obama, 48% votes for Mitt Romney. Okay, so that's a 3% gap. Well, in that state, what's the gap between the Republican and the Democrat candidate for Senate? Now, we're trying to identify what is the causal effect of losing your local news source on split ticket voting. And this is difficult to do, right? I'm sure I'm not surprising anyone by telling you that inferring causation without being able to actually randomly assign ourselves a community to lose its newspaper is really hard, right? That's inferring causality from observational data is extraordinarily difficult. And what I'm going to present to you is our approach to it. I'm happy to weed deeper into the causal inference weeds in the unrecorded portion of this because I think about this a lot. So what our approach was utilizing a statistical technique called genetic matching, which I won't belabor too much to keep 90% of you from leaving the room immediately. But regardless, what we tried to do was construct effectively a set of what we would call treated and control American counties. So what we would try to do is compare like for like. So first, we would only compare counties from within the same state that are dealing with the same Senate race, number one. And then statistically looked at the distributions of things like percentage of non-white people, average age, percentage female, average income, college attainment, et cetera, et cetera. And this technique tries to create a match set of the treatment here is losing your newspaper, and these control counties did not experience a closure. But statistically, they were indistinguishable from each other on all of these covariates that you see up here. When you compare the counties that lost a newspaper between 2009 and 2012 and their matched counterparts that are statistically indistinguishable on all the things that we were able to measure and look at here, we saw that a community that lost its newspaper at the county level had almost 2% less split ticket voting in the 2012 election between president and Senate. Now, how big a number that sounds like to you is, of course, entirely subjective. But of course, we can all think of significant elections that have been decided by much less than 1.9%. So we think that this is a meaningful effect here. And again, I'll talk about, can you believe this, right? Is this true? Well, we wanted to interrogate the finding as hard as we could using the methods that we were applying here. So again, I can dig into this much more for anyone who's curious and wants to nerd out on some methods with me. But we did conduct a few things. We conducted a sensitivity analysis. We said, first of all, what if we're missing something about the selection process by which a county loses its newspaper, right? We modeled as best we could with the things you could measure. We said, well, what if we forgot something? What if there's something else that causes a community to lose its newspaper? How big would its effect have had to have been for our inference of causality to go away? We found it was again, we can get into the weeds of this, but a reasonably significant, we've had to miss something pretty meaningful, right? Bigger than an expansion of broadband in your community, for example. We also conducted what we called a placebo test. So we also gathered data on counties that lost their newspaper in 2013 and 2014. So after the 2012 election. And we did the same exact analysis, acting as if the treatment was losing a newspaper after the 2012 election. So logically, it's impossible for a newspaper closure post-election to cause any changes in your voting outcomes in 2012. And we found, fortunately, otherwise this probably wouldn't have been published, that losing a newspaper after the election under the same analytic framework had no effect whatsoever on split ticket voting. So that gives us some increased confidence in the conclusion that we're drawing here. And then we looked at whether this was a case of, well, are people have they just lost information about politics as a general matter, right? Maybe it's not this subtraction and replacement into national partisan news, but maybe it's just, well, there's less information available, so maybe that's what's causing the problem here. So what we looked at was ballot roll-off. So whether people filled out their entire ballot, what percentage of people failed to cast a vote for, say, the House of Representatives or the other down ticket races. And we found there was no effect of newspaper closure, which suggests to us that the mechanism here is probably in these affected counties that lose a local source of political information, or at least potential political information, sorting into partisan national replacements, that we're seeing more partisan voting, but not indications that they're in a, generally speaking, information impoverished environment. Now, as a bit of professional advice for any graduate students who may be in the HXA watching here or watching on YouTube, I would say if you want journalists to write about your research, one of the best things to do is conduct research that is about journalists. Because what ended up happening when we published this paper in 2018 in the Journal of Communication, there was, by far the most in my career, meaningful media attention here. So we published some public-facing stuff in Scientific American, The Conversation. We counted over 80 news outlets that covered the finding. My dad grew up reading The New Yorker, so when Claire Malone mentioned our study in The New Yorker, I had to immediately change the slide, so that was in there only for him. And so this was really exciting. So we were talking to a few people, giving talks like this about this particular paper. But that leads to the second half of what I want to talk about here. What did we do after this? So, okay, after this finding, there's an association between the provision of local news and polarized voting, split ticket voting. So I think as a consequence of this media attention, the Desert Sun in Palm Springs, California, Julie McKinnon, their editor, noticed the piece, noticed our paper, noticed the finding, and thought to themselves, what if we could do something about this relationship between local news content and polarization in the United States? So we were tremendously excited. In the summer of 2019, it came across the transom that the Palm Springs Desert Sun was going to remove all mentions of national partisan politics from its opinion pages for the entire month of July 2019. So we're not going to talk about it. We will talk about California politics, Palm Springs politics, but you're not going to hear about Donald Trump. You're not going to hear about Nancy Pelosi. You're not going to hear about the sort of things that would often fill up the op-ed pages, especially if you rely on syndicated columnists, right? So this was enormously exciting to myself, my co-authors, Drs. Dunaway and Dar. And we thought this was a wonderful opportunity to conduct a second study here. We do know that op-eds, there's a wonderful study by Alex Kopic and co-authors that does suggest that op-eds in local newspapers can meaningfully influence opinion on target issues in both citizens and elites. And this is a place where the Desert Sun is emphasizing issues of concern to the community that cut across those national political identities. Being a citizen of Palm Springs is not necessarily the same thing as being a nationally oriented Republican or Democrat. For any political science adjacent folks in the room, we chose the name Homestyle intentionally as a nod to the late great Dick Fenno and his book on members of Congress. And this idea is that a homestyle of a member of Congress or a news source emphasizes the local community and its needs, cutting across any sort of national political agenda or platform. Fenno argued this was a way members of Congress cultivated their own individual influence. Similarly, we were curious if the Desert Sun's emphasis on the home style, so to speak, on the issues idiosyncratic to Palm Springs in Southern California would have an influence on the community they were serving. So we were very curious about this. The three of us and some research assistants ended up reading every op-ed they published in June, July, and August. We can sort of see here, as we get into that experiment they were doing, they called it that, of emphasizing local issues, local affairs in the month of July. We see things about utility overhauls in the California legislature, artistic formation and support in the Palm Springs area, that sort of thing. So again, we're concerned, of course, about inferring causation from this. So what we did, sort of in some ways a similar sort of approach, we found another community in Southern California that was also served by a Gannett newspaper, Ventura County, that was doing nothing of the sort, right? They were just going to do business as usual for the month of July, when the Desert Sun was doing its experiment, removing any references to national politics from its op-ed pages. And here you can see, here's a lovely little map of Southern California. It was snowing here this morning, so I probably wish I was there. But you can see Ventura and Palm Springs, they sort of bracket the greater Los Angeles area, though Palm Springs is a little further out. So two Southern California areas, we got them statistically very close to each other. That's another reason we picked Ventura. Similarly, they're not exactly the same, but they're similar in a lot of important ways. And so we've got these two, we've got essentially a treated community of Palm Springs and a control community, Ventura. So we raced as fast as we possibly could to do some surveys, both representative samples from the zip codes in Palm Springs and Ventura, respectively. We got the first group before any of this changed with the Desert Sun, and we did a second wave as the experiment was winding down between July 23rd and August 8th. For any fans of the Open Science Foundation, we did pre-register our hypotheses before we did any of this work or analyzed any of the data. So we have two surveys, before and after, in a treated and a control community. We were looking at very similar things. Of course, there was no election in July of 2019, so we had to do more attitudinal measures. I'm going to focus here on measures of affective polarization. So similar feeling thermometers, how do you feel about your party and the other party and the difference there? We also asked some questions about social polarization, which is a very related concept, but basically, how comfortable would you be if your child were to marry a member of the other political party? And if people said they were not uncomfortable with that, that's a measure of social polarization, which is, hand in glove with these emotional and psychological measures of polarization. So the first thing we have to do, that I'd like to do to convince you of the validity of this approach. So first, as I said, we read all these different op-eds, we looked at the content. So it's important to note that I really like this. You look across June, July, and August, when the experiment was being run, what percentage of op-eds and editorials, as well as letters to the editor, because they're also in the op-ed section, what's the percentage that referred to topics of idiosyncratic to California? And we can see in June and August, half or less were referring to California. During the experiment month, the July month, the Desert Sun, was over 90% of those op-eds and editorials were referring to California. Did they mention President Trump? No, they did not. So we can see here in the bottom panel, right? Effectively zero. One letter to the editor snuck in during the month of the experiment. So almost a third of op-eds and editorials mentioned President Trump before and after their experiment, nothing during. So the treatment was administered, right? All right, so there's a lot going on in this figure, but I want to talk about our sort of major outcomes here. So what we did here is what's a difference in difference analysis. So looking at how much did Palm Springs change before and after the experiment? How much did Ventura change? And we can ascribe any difference in those differences to the treatment of the Palm Springs Desert Suns experiment. So all these hypotheses were pre-registered because we are looking at some subsets of the data here. So again, from these representative surveys in the relevant zip codes. All right, so to look at these panels here. So what we're looking at is, do you prefer to read the local newspaper? Oh, sorry, this is affective polarization. I misspoke there. Affective polarization on the y-axis. So that's that difference between your rating of your party and the other party. The higher the number, the more polarized you are. That's the way this is coded. So when the lines are going up, they're getting more polarized. Now, what we can see here in the black diamonds are Palm Springs respondents. The gray circles are our Ventura, our control respondents. So for people who preferred the newspaper, in Ventura, affective polarization went up before and after the Desert Suns experiment, remains flat in Palm Springs. And then if you go down here to folks who are high in political involvement, so politically engaged and active, we can see again that our Ventura respondents, their polarization, affective polarization rises a bit, remains flat for our treated group in Palm Springs. So what we're seeing here is not a decrease in polarization in Palm Springs. Rather, if you remember July of 2019, 600 years ago, what you had was the Mueller report was dropping. There was tremendous sort of, just as the entirety of that season of our political history and culture was, a lot of oxygen otherwise in the national media was being consumed by President Trump. Things were heated, as they always were. And so in Ventura, among these sort of folks who were likely to be paying attention and to be participating in politics, our Ventura respondents were growing more polarized. Our Palm Springs respondents were remaining flat. So what we're seeing is a slowing in the growth of affective polarization in Palm Springs. Let's see. Now here's our responses on our social polarization measure. So these are folks who would say, I am uncomfortable with my child marrying a member of the opposite political party. And again, you've got the panels here. So we're subsetting by the kinds of folks for whom newspaper op-eds might make a difference. And again, these were pre-registered hypotheses. So as you see here, for those who preferred to read the newspaper on the top panel here, the predicted probability of saying, I don't want my child marrying someone from that party, it rises noticeably among our Ventura respondents, much more gradually in Palm Springs, among those with high political knowledge who can answer factual questions about American politics correctly. Who's the Chief Justice of the United States? That sort of thing. Our high knowledge subjects. In Ventura, the control community, that probability of saying, no, I don't want my child marrying someone from that party, that goes up, stays flat in Palm Springs. The exact same dynamic for the politically involved. More social polarization before and after in Ventura, flat in Palm Springs. Did anyone who reads the paper actually notice that this was going on? Well, this isn't the same sample that I just showed you because that was a representative sample. But we did also explicitly reach out to readers of the Desert Sun and just be like, hey, anything seem different about your paper? And 38% said that yes, they'd noticed a difference. We had some open-ended items on that. Folks said they love it. I appreciate that. Someone said better, but biased. Would have loved to have talked to that person a little more to see what they were interested in there. So we did see this difference, this slowing of the growth of social and affective polarization in Palm Springs as a result of de-emphasizing national partisan politics and re-emphasizing cross-cutting local geographically based identities on the op-ed pages. I won't go into this too much, but whenever I give this talk to journalistic audiences, they're always very curious about this. Well, did the paper just go broke? Like, are they really taking an enormous risk that this content that might be attractive to their readers? And in fact, we did not see that. The paper was very generous to share a lot of their internal data with us, that their page views, their clicks, unique visitors were not significantly impacted by this change, which was really terrific. So if there's any newspaper editors out there who might be thinking of trying something similar, reach out to me, reach out to Julie McKinnon. We can tell you it's not going to crater your business model to talk about what's going on in your community. Just to give you an example, so what were the major stories before the experiment in June? You can see stuff about Trump. You can see actually their op-ed about this summer vacation was in there as well. Their average for their top 50 op-ed pages in June was 486. It was 513 during the month of July when they ran their experiment. So statistically, negligible, but it's clear that they didn't crater reader interest and engagement here. And you can see what were they writing about during the month of the experiment, talking about water, right? Major issue, of course, in the entire Western United States, as many folks would obviously know. CalPERS, the California pension system, right? I'm sure an issue near and dear to folks all over the state of California. Actually, tremendously, I learned a lot. They're planning to build a minor league ice hockey arena in Palm Springs during this time. So if you want to see hockey in the desert, I think that made its way through. Those are the sort of things that mattered in that community, talking about traffic, historic architectural preservation. These things are not necessarily Republican or Democratic issues, but they are issues that were near and dear to the residents of Palm Springs. Okay, so I want to leave plenty of time for our Q&A here, so I'm going to wind it down. So that's where we're at with this research agenda. If you find this interesting, Homestyle Opinion was published in 2021 by Cambridge University Press. It's a thin book. It's a nice beach read. You can breeze through it while you're sitting by the pool here over your Christmas holidays. We are always on the lookout to continue this research agenda. Josh, Joanna, and I are always emailing each other, thinking about opportunities. So we're looking for other local news ecosystems, other kinds of opportunities to investigate this relationship between the institution of local news, what it does, its presence or absence, and political outcomes, both behaviorally and psychologically. So that's all I've got. If you are interested in any of this work, my website is just my name, MatthewPHitt.com. Links are all up there to all our public-facing scholarship. If you want to download the paper, that's the first QR code. If you want to check out the book with Cambridge, that's the other QR code. Really look forward to hearing thoughts, questions, and comments, talking more about this with you all. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Matt. So much to think about here. So yeah, as Matt said, we're now going to turn to a time of Q&A and conclude the recorded portion of the evening. For those watching this recording later on our YouTube channel, thanks for popping in. And we warmly invite you to attend a live event soon and join the conversation.